We begin in Israel, a country I was reporting from just a few weeks ago. When I was in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv, I told you how the protests across Israel are almost unprecedented. So many people from so many different fields of life came together to try and put an end to the proposed judicial reforms and to stop the government from what the protesters feel was a severe weakening of the country's judiciary and an erosion of democracy. Now, the government and its supporters emphatically told me why they felt the reforms were necessary. In case you missed that, here's a quick recap.
Now, what's happening? The executive is pretty much saying we should control the judiciary.
No, the executive is saying the judiciary should have at least one check. The judiciary in this country is completely unchecked. There is no one check. In regular countries, in regular democracies, the judiciary has one check, which is the government selects judges.
Now, I came back from Israel a couple of weeks ago, and in these weeks, the protests have spread further. More people joined in. It became stronger and stronger until it reached a climax where the power of the people forced those in power to bend their knee.
I have decided to suspend the second and third readings of the law in this term of the Knesset in order to allow the time to reach that wide consensus ahead of legislation during the next Knesset. This way or the other, we will bring a reform that will reinstate the lost balance between the authorities while preserving, and I will add, strengthening civil rights.
We will bring the reform, but not now. That's essentially the message from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And honestly, many people saw this coming, especially after that general strike was actually announced. And you had a situation where the Ben Gurion airport was shut down, planes were not being able to take off. Israeli missions across the world also were starting to go on strike. You had police commissioners marching on the streets. So it became clear that it was an unsustainable situation. After all, how long can one man and a handful of his rather extreme supporters stand up against what seems to be the will of the people, and the will of the people which was really paralyzing life on the ground? In some of the most dramatic protests in any democratic country, certainly as a percentage of the people who were actually out on the roads, Israelis left no stone unturned to put pressure on Netanyahu. Let me just show you some of the visuals that have come out of Israel this week. Look at that sea of blue, the wave of protests that swept Jerusalem this week. We saw Israeli commandos, Navy SEALs staging underwater protests against the reforms.
It's not a matter of majority or minority, right or left. The people have spoken, and there's no one stronger than the people of Israel.
The people of Israel made this point pretty loud and clear, and their message reached not just the leaders at home, but also those outside Israel. The American President, Joe Biden, for example.
So what do you hope the Prime Minister will do on that particular law?
I hope he walks away from it.
And walk away he did, but only after invoking a story from the Bible, the story of the judgment of Solomon. I'm sure most of you would have read this or heard this at some point in your life. The story is about a king. He had to rule between two women, both of whom claimed to be the mother of the child. How did King Solomon decide who the real mother was? Well, he ordered that the child be cut in half. The woman who protested the ruling was finally figured out by King Solomon that was the child's real mother. Netanyahu told the story to Israelis while announcing his decision to temporarily hold the reform. As for Biden's rebuke, here's what the Israeli Prime Minister had to say about that. Allow me to quote, "Israel is a sovereign country which makes its decisions by the will of its people and not based on pressures from abroad, including from the best of friends." And we know who the best of friends was that he was referring to right now. Now, the big question that clearly we are asking, what is next? What's next for Benjamin Netanyahu? Now that the judicial reforms have been shelved, what happens next? What happens to the protests? What happens to the bill? What happens to Netanyahu's coalition? What happens to his political future? Well, let's try and answer some of those questions one by one. First of all, the protests. Well, they refuse to die down. People are still out on the streets of Israel. Many say that they are now protesting the plan to establish a separate national guard. Now, let me try and add some context of that for you. You see, earlier this week, Israel's far-right Jewish Power Party said that the deal to delay the legislation would involve the creation of a national guard, one that is controlled by the party's leader and Israel's national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Simply put, this party is a part of the coalition government, and what it is essentially saying is the only way that this party will agree to Netanyahu's decision to delay the judicial reform is if the Prime Minister guarantees the formation of this National Guard. And clearly, the protesters aren't happy about that either.
Ben-Gvir, who is a minister in Bibi's government, he wants to have a private police department only for him, so he can maybe control the Palestinians and the left-wing demonstrators. So we are a part of the big demonstrations against the government.
Now, question number 2, what happens to the judicial reforms? Well, those reforms are very much alive. The reforms have been stalled, not cancelled. It's just a matter of time before the Netanyahu government pushes for clipping the wings of the judiciary once again. Now, when that's going to happen, no one knows, but they're very clear it is going to happen at some point. Now, question number 3, what happens to Netanyahu's coalition? You see, the whole judicial reform idea was not really Netanyahu's brainchild, despite what it may seem like, given his ongoing probes and those questions around his particular personal future. The reforms were actually not on Netanyahu's personal priority list. The reform was one of the pillars Netanyahu's far-right coalition was built on. And now its survival depends on what will happen next to these reforms. If Netanyahu decides to shelve it for good, his coalition could potentially collapse. If he tries to view the coalition, Netanyahu's government faces the risk of collapsing in the face of protests. In short, it is a catch-22 situation that Netanyahu's office and his political future hinges on. So what happens next? It's a question that is also underpinned by a fundamental dichotomy that I heard a lot about in Israel, and that is also the growing rift between secular Jews in Israel and the ultra-Orthodox. Yes, there is a rift there. The only cleavages in Israel are not the ones that you keep hearing about between the Jews and the Arabs, or the Israelis and the Palestinians, or Israel as a country and some of its neighbors. There's also a rift between the secular Jews and the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox. Now, the ultra-Orthodox have been given various concessions in the past. For example, they don't have to serve in the army, unlike all other Israelis. Many of them, they don't work, so therefore they're not paying taxes, but they're still getting allowances. And yet, they seem to be calling the shots. They're calling the shots in politics, as with the judicial reforms. And now they're calling the shots with things like the settlements in the West Bank. Now, this is a divide that we must turn our attention to, because that divide also underlines a lot of what is happening in Israel. And let's now bring in a special guest to answer this question, Anat Bernstein-Reich. She's the president of Israel Asia in the Chambers of Commerce, also been heading India-Israel in the Chambers of Commerce for a very, very long time. She's now joining us from Tel Aviv. Anat, thank you so much for joining us. A pleasure talking to you as always. Just tell us about these momentous few weeks in Israel. Do you think Benjamin Netanyahu was forced into taking the step after the general strike was announced?
I think that it's not that he was forced, but he realized that there should be some better discussion, I would say, with the liberal base that was protesting. And for 3 months, his coalition government was rushing to make the reform. I mean, they call it reform. The protesters called it judicial revolution. So there was a point, it was Sunday night, when people spontaneously went out to the street after he fired his defense minister. And it was clear that there is anger, really anger within the people. Doesn't matter if they are right or left. It was beyond right or left, that there should be some wider discussion between the coalition, the opposition, to reach some more basic understandings and to cool down. Israel is getting into holidays soon. Next week we have Passover, then we have the Independence Day, Remembrance Day, and it was clear that this country cannot go like that further. He had to cool everyone down.
Okay, so let me just understand what you said a little bit further. You said the liberals are unhappy with it, and of course they were unhappy with it, and for multiple reasons. But it also seemed to be escalating way beyond that. There was this general strike call, the largest trade union saying nothing is going to operate, planes not being able to take off from the airport, diplomats overseas saying we're going to be going on strike as well. So this seems to have almost escalated almost to a civil disobedience level, you know, like Indian level, Mahatma Gandhi scale. That's the sense that we were starting to get. It's heading that way.
Don't call it even civil disobedience. The extreme right call the protesters anarchists. They're not anarchists. They are protesting. And this protest went just beyond the judicial reform. It opened a Pandora box, a Pandora box that was closed for many years, because there is a friction between the religious, ultra-Orthodox party and the people and the secular base. And the secular base said, you're breaking the contract. We have unwritten contract that was put in the Pandora box. Okay, and for many years, the secular people said, we are carrying the taxes, we are carrying the defense load. Enough. You want too much, and we're not willing to give. And that's what created the big anger.
So I sensed a bit of that schism talking to people in Israel. Look at, for example, the West Bank, some of the other issues that dominate conversation when it comes to Israel. Now, the settlements in the West Bank, for example, now quite often it is the ultra-Orthodox and others like that who are saying that we must have settlements in the West Bank, what they call Judea and Samaria, let's have settlements there. And then the temperatures get raised, which is okay. But then if there's warfare or there's tension or the shooting starts, then they aren't necessarily the ones who are facing it. It is people in the IDF and others who will be facing the brunt of that.
Exactly so. We need to understand that the ultra-Orthodox community follows the Bible. And according to the Bible, those territories also belong to Israel. So they truly believe that it's okay for them to live in the settlements and in those territories. However, those territories are now belong or are held by the Palestinian people. And there is friction between those two communities that the IDF is need to take care of. So that's another friction. And we need to also remember that the month of the Ramadan started this week. And the Ramadan brings additional friction between Muslims and the Jews. So that was another point that says, how can you fire a defense minister during such an explosive month where we're trying to calm everyone and not entice the people to do things that none of us want to happen.
So looking at the past, none of this is really new, that these rules, these systems have existed more or less since the formation of Israel. Why is it that the Orthodox or the ultra-Orthodox, they're sometimes described as the far right, how come they have got so much more power right now? Are there some dynamics because their population has been rising? So they've always had some of the privileges. So why is it that this has become a political hot potato now?
Okay, so the reason for them asking, they're trying to pass, as we call the judicial reform, but it's more than that. There are 141 proposal for laws which are trying to take Israel from being a secular country to a religious country. I'll give you an example. We're towards Passover, and during Passover, the Jewish tradition, you cannot eat wheat or bread. this law, the new law that they're trying to pass, the ultra-Orthodox, will force hospitals and many other places later not to allow entrance of breads or wheats, in a sense that they want to impose the religious rules on secular people. And there are a few other laws against minorities that have impact. I wouldn't say that they are directly, but they have impact on women's rights or on LGBT rights, on the right to give service. So all those laws are pushed by the ultra-Orthodox. And if you look at the coalition of Prime Minister Netanyahu, this is a coalition that is built on several parties.
All right, Anat, we've heard what the American president also was saying about pausing these reforms and what's been happening with Netanyahu. Now, it's not just about the ultra-Orthodox and the judicial reforms alone. The protesters have been painting this as a fight for democracy. Why is that the case? I mean, if these are judicial reforms, why is it being seen as a democracy is on the line and there's a rise of authoritarianism and dictatorship could come and replace democracy? Why are those issues coming up, and where do you see Israel headed from here?
Okay. The Likud party and the coalition definitely don't see it as a revolution, okay? They see it just as a judicial reform, and actually it's true. The judicial system in Israel needs to undergo some reform. The liberal base said it's too much. What you're asking will kill the checks and balances between the judicial, the executive, and the government. What the liberal base is saying, you're killing our base of democracy. We're moving into dictatorship because eventually the government will have the power to do everything. At the moment, the Supreme Court in Israel is an important body that is able to overrule laws which are against the base laws of Israel. We don't have a constitution, and this is another problem. This is another issue that is now under discussion. In 1950, when India had its constitution, Israel was supposed to get its constitution as well, but then it was delayed over the years and we did a few base laws, but we never got into a full constitution that says that we are democratic, equality, etc., etc.
But would I be correct in saying that as of the immediate present moment, there's no threat to the Netanyahu government and whatever may be happening around here? He did get a vote, he passed a vote of confidence, and it's going to be a very, very tricky situation to going ahead. But is his government secure? Is the government safe? Or do you think the dynamics are such that even the government could be at risk?
I think that his government is, of course, there was friction at the moment. His government will continue for the time being. You know that this is the 5th election in the past 5 years. Each year we had one election or two. But it seems that still this government is strong because it has a majority of 64 to 56. We are a parliament of 126. So they will pass few laws. They will be milder. I hope that they will be able to reach some understanding. The big law that everyone talks about is the appointment of judges, the committee, and the president of Israel. Like in India, we have a president which is beyond the party or the sides. So the president invited both parties, both sides, the coalition, opposition, to sit, discuss, and try to find a solution that will strengthen our democracy and will keep the checks and balances and will calm down, because what happened here in the past few weeks, it's really unpleasant. Pleasant is an understatement, of course.
All right, Anat, thank you so much for joining us with that particular perspective, and we'll keep a very close eye on whatever's happening in Israel in the weeks and months ahead. Anat Bernstein-Reich, thank you so much.